Tate Chronicles now transmitting.
Welcome to the Tate Chronicles on Healthcare Now Radio. And now, here's your host, Jim Tate.
Good day, citizens of the free world, from border to border, coast to coast, and to all that ships at sea. I bring you a warm welcome. This is your correspondent, Jim Tate, and thank you for tuning into the Tate Chronicles. Join me as we cut through the fog that exists at the leading edge of healthcare technology. I'm very pleased. My guest today is Kyle Meadors, the founder of Chart Lux Consulting. Chart Lux exists to provide expert analysis, insight, and strategy into the complex regulations and standards which impact healthcare professionals and health IT developers. Kyle acts as a principal consultant to such entities as government agencies, EHR developers, and the standards organizations. Kyle, welcome to the Tate Chronicles.
Hey, Jim. I'm really glad to be here.
Appreciate you joining me and our audience. Kyle, I've known you in a professional capacity for over 10 years, and I've always valued your perspective on things. But first, give me a little bit of overview. What kind of work are you doing at Chart Lux, and who are your clients?
Sure. So, yeah, and I probably mentioned, we first got connected back when I worked at Drummond Group, back when the whole EHR stuff, ONC certification, at least there was the EHR course before that, but when the ONC cert program started, and I was the founding testing director there and proctored, and remember this guy named Jim Tate here who is helping these people out, and we'd cross our paths, and I always enjoyed chatting with you and stuff, and your vendors, your customers always did a great job, and so we kind of that was me and my origin. Obviously, when we crossed paths, and then I was going through that and just getting into this world of regulations and health IT stuff, and then about 5 or 6 years into that, I decided I thought I not just because of you or anything, but I thought about doing consulting and found because when you're at Drummond, you can really help people with guidance, but you're also limited at the same time. You can't cross that line. You can't give them the answers. You're helpful, but you ultimately are, the proctor to evaluate them. And I felt that there were some opportunities that I could go, on the other side and, help really, as you led into, about cut through the fog of some of this. That's really, with Chart Lux, when I founded it, our logo is this, lighthouse, and it's kind of that idea is kind of this beacon to help give people insight. Because one of the things I remember at Drummond, our CFO, a guy named Bill Smith, was said, Kyle, we're trying to. These people are walking through the valley of darkness, and we're just here to hold their hand and tell them it's okay. And and so I've kind of tried to embody that a lot. So I do work alongside. I'd say primarily, Jim, EHR vendors are my biggest segment of customers, from large people that you guys would know of, but then also some really smaller shops, helping them usually approaching certification, ONC certification, but then usually after that's achieved, branching off to some other activities. I do work with other groups, other provider organizations, and it's all kind of around helping them kind of understand review, analysis, planning on health IT regulations from the ONC and CMS, and then kind of taking those to some next steps.
That's what I'm really curious about, because like you have been aware that this entire industry, health information technology, so much of it is driven by government legislation and regulations related to CMS reimbursement schemes and the Office of National Coordinator standards around different coding types and coding standards. And software developers, they need to know what they need to develop. But it's often not black and white. It's kind of gray and fuzzy for a number of years, and then it kind of goes back and forth. So how do you advise as to what to pay attention to and the chances of what you think might be the standards? There could be, as we had during the COVID crisis, a lot of the standards that had a deadline were actually extended a year or two. So
yeah. I know people love that. I guess a couple things on those, makes me think of, because you're right. I mean, that's certainly the gist of it is, anyone can pick up and read a regulation, even if a lot of times people will literally pay me because they don't want to. But the value that I want to add to people is kind of the fact that you have, I guess, one, that these are oftentimes kind of opaque or confusing phrasing and terminology. Things are maybe implied. So, helping people kind of understand how those are connected. And then the fact that not just the statements themselves are confusing, but they're often kind of, separated, and you have to go to look at various different regulations to tie back. Like there was something that came up with somebody the other day, and it was in the MITS program. But like the answer to this is actually, I had to go back to meaningful use stage 2 ruling, and because it builds on it, everything's kind of this layered approach and this kind of overlapping regulations. And so trying to go back and showing how everything's connected together. I think then, once you kind of know that and you kind of can bring that, expertise, I think the biggest thing is trying to, one, how to figure out people's, individual risk, tolerance of things. Because you're right, things I can try to clarify and make things clear, but there is always going to be a sort of, unknownness about it. Yes. And like you said, ONC or whoever, CMS, for reasons, sometimes we think they're good, sometimes we think they're bad, but they delay or they change things. And so I always try to figure out where people are at, and give them the kind of the range of options. Like, we could do it this way. This is probably a very conservative approach, meaning I am almost 100% confident we will not have any problem getting this through, not only in this year, but the years to come. And, you have this right here is on the other side. Here would be maybe a more liberal approach that I think we can definitely, in good faith, argue that this is the right way to do things based on what was said. But we recognize that there's some things that weren't said. We're not going to go and try to, go that route right now. We're going to maybe wait to give some to where maybe further clarification or change. And I think that people just have to, I just want to put those forward to everyone and lay them out kind of what would be involved. If we went down the more liberal route of interpretation, then here would be the changes we'd have to do, going forward if they later, switch courses. And I just try to put those forward so people can really feel, I guess, empowered to make the decision. I think that's the thing I'm really trying to give is I think as I deal with people, they're running businesses. These are, successful individuals. They are good decision makers. They just don't always have the information at hand to make those decisions. So I'm trying to put it down. I think I really try to pride myself on is really the education component and really trying to distill it down to its essence so people are really clear on what really is needed, what's not, take the fluff out, make it in, analogies and other applications to help people, figure it out so that they then can say, all right, yes, I got it. We are good with this approach. Mm-hmm. And then once they're down that route, then I'm supporting them. I do think, we try to, it's always a balance about how far out do you want to go because it does things change. And I will say now at this point, my general approach is here's where I think it will go, next year. But until it's really stated, I suggest let's just simply be aware of it and have some knowledge. Sometimes I'll talk to people who are just, the type A personality, like, all right, we're ready to implement the US CDI version, not just version 2, which just came out, but the level, level A's or whatever it is, the things that they're proposing for in a couple years. I'm like, that's good, but why don't we just let's just get our first steps right now and then see, because so many things do change, Jim. And so, but again, you got to feel where everyone else is at. And I try to distill that down to meet them at their needs and their kind of organizational culture.
One thing you say there, Kyle, I think is really true that they're almost like stepping stones that they put in front of us. And so the whole issue of interoperability, being able to exchange data, I don't know whether it was 5 or 10 years ago, the certification requirements that you had to be able to create interoperability type file with patient information. It could be what they call a CCDA a CCD or a CCR, and then there had to be a CCD. And then a little further down the road, there had to be very specific information, and then more information had to be the functionality to carry more information. And then the next step obviously was these AP APIs, we'll talk about in detail in a minute, so you could that data could flow and then not flow just with entire record, but very discrete aspects of a record could flow. So you couldn't go from square one to square 10 in one jump. We had to take those steps. And if you're familiar with those steps, you have some level of confidence of where the industry is going.
Yeah.
Not in terms of interface or any of that kind of stuff, but in terms of functionality and interoperability.
You're exactly right. And I think that's actually, Jim, it makes me think of something I try to always advise people on. Because I mentioned about giving people the pathways, how you want to do it. But I always tell them, whichever way you do it, you need to do it, whatever path you do, you need to do it right. Meaning, because, well, just to get to your point, that it's probably going to be built on. And so we want it done in a way that it can be extendable later on. So if you were putting together your, like back in the day, how you were capturing your problems, your medications according to SNOMED or RxNorm, whatever the codes are, you really did it. You designed your database in a way that you knew that you could later on manipulate and use that data. You weren't just throwing it together to pass the test, so to speak, because that's fine to get through then, but then later on, they're going to ask you to build, to these steps 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you at least need to have whatever, even if you did a more conservative footprint than someone else, or I'm kind of mixing conservative and liberal here, but, smaller footprint, you didn't go all out. Whatever you did it well so that you can then later build on. And I think that's the thing that I would always tell people is, if you look, we now have 10 plus years of history of this. And there certainly have been some routes that people have went where it kind of went, I don't say nowhere, but it's not as far as you thought they would. But for the most part, it's really been pretty well connected, and nothing has just truly been, a total lost effort. And therefore, anything you're going to do now, do it in a way that that can be built on in the future. So it is something really important to think. And I think ONC, you can argue there's things that they've done could have done better, but for the most part, I think they've done some really good things to get to where we're at now. I mean, It really did lay a good foundation.
Yeah. Well, Kyle, we've been talking about the future, so let's talk about the future. What kind of deadlines or changes do you see on the roadmap for 2022?
I really think 2022 is very much a transition building year. And what I mean by that is there are several things that are kind of pushing toward that's going to start happening next year. We're not going to see the fruits really until a couple years down the road, but I think it's a really crucial year for a couple of reasons. I do think obviously the information blocking is one of the big things right now. Information sharing, as ONC is trying to rebrand it, which is a good idea. It's always better to make it a positive than a negative.
That's true.
But this whole expansion to the full EHI, and I think that's a big lift. And so people have to get that implemented this year. And you also have the deadlines for the Fire version 4, the Smart on Fire. When you have all let's just say by the end of the year, all that stuff is done for the vast majority of the EHR vendors. It doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have, immediately all these new applications who are taking advantage of this. But now we finally have elevated to the point where those can. And I really think people need to be, taking this year as a way to really, again, lay this solid foundation, because I don't see, if I'm a healthcare provider, I think my health IT stuff next year looks pretty similar to what it was last year, to be honest. I mean, I don't think that's my view of it. But then what's going to start happening is not only with that, you have the whole MIPS value pathway changes. That's going to start kind of making adjustments. Those, of course, will be voluntary starting in 2023. So I think in some ways, from a provider standpoint, this next year is going to be maybe a very similar year, but you're going to certainly start seeing after that people, not only request for APIs, but maybe new opportunities to interface systems together to utilize this and do some creative and clever ways. So I that's my thought, Jim, is that that this year is kind of by no means the last year. That's ridiculous, of course. But one of the I think one of the big things that ONC's really has worked toward is to really kind of get this platform in place from a technology standpoint. I think there will be future regulations that will come out, of course, beyond it, but they're really kind of, in some ways, maxing out what you can do in some regard. I mean, you have to share all the data, all EHI. You have to.
Yes.
We have CCDAs. We have APIs. We have public health. Measured. We have all this stuff now that's built in, and I think you're going to start seeing then the fruits that's going to be on the outside of that. That's going to start taking advantage of this there. So that's kind of where I'm seeing things happen.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there's some things that I think people need to think about how to get prepared for that. Doesn't mean if I'm a provider that I need to be doing nothing next year and just kind of watching. But that's kind of how I'm seeing the roadmap kind of come together. And I mean, next year is like this building, this putting this next scaffolding in that's going to be really important. And once we have that in place, I think there's a lot of things that are going to happen starting in 2023 and then certainly in 2024 in terms of how you expect people actually sharing data.
Well, that's the thing. You use the word, Kyle, scaffolding. I think, in my mind, I think of plumbing sometimes. You get that there, and you want that data to start flowing through it. And sometimes that is a cultural thing for providers to want access to that kind of data and willing to share that kind of data. Sometimes technology comes along. I can remember, maybe in the early 80s when medical practices started using fax machines. And it was such an incredible overnight improvement. Every practice in the country went out and bought a fax machine so they could have clinical notes faxed to them if a patient showed up and you didn't know why they were there. So it may not be that abrupt an adoption of this interoperability, but certainly the functionality has got to be put down. Now, that kind of brings me to these organizations that have kind of been formed or have come together. Commonwealth and this Sequoia project and this TEFCA, all these organizations that are, I don't know, would you say their mission is to promote common standards and interoperability?
Yeah, they're kind of trying to establish the highway of data sharing. And I mean, listen, you mentioned on the facts. I just want to maybe say that real quick. That
sure,
because you love people, or you love hearing these people say, like, kill the facts, and all this, in health IT world. Let's get rid of the facts. And I'm sympathetic to that. But I also think, why don't people ask, why did people like the facts so much?
Oh, wow, yeah.
I mean, it was like, I'm a person. I like to read. I'm a really busy person. Can you just show me something right now in front of me that I can take? And I'm walking between, clinics or offices or whatever to see a patient that tells me that some quick things that I need to know about them. And the fax is a great source. And so in some ways, we kind of went away in the ONC SERP from being, anti-faxing. Everything was structured data. And we're just now kind of getting back to say, all right, let's share clinical notes. Let's find ways to make, data, any EHI available, even things that are maybe more in a PDF form or whatever. And that's why I'm saying, I think I'm really encouraged by it, that we're going to have some stuff in place to make this, to really start actually getting aligned with what, I think providers, how they actually want to work. And I think that's the thing for the TEFCA and the Sequoia stuff. And I should say too, what I said earlier, that why I'm excited about the future. I'm by no means thinking that it's going to be without hiccups. There's a lot of reasons why people may be hesitant to make changes, again, some very valid reasons. But I hope if we can get this in place, I mean, there has to be a certain seamlessness to it, ubiquity to it. So there is going to have to be this almost like tipping point that eventually enough systems are connected through this, with like Commonwealth, the Sequoia, TEFCA stuff done, that it's more or less just there. Like I talk about the 80s. I remember going back, this is an early memory of my dad buying a car, and he was all excited because it had power windows, and I was like, oh, look at this, Kyle. I mean, it's like, look, I can just push this button and it just goes down. No more of that hand cranking, and as I know if your younger audience may not even know what that is, but for us, of course, we remember that, and that used to be a feature that you had to add. You had to buy, upgrade power windows, power locks. But eventually enough people became to expect it that it had to become de facto just part of your standard package. Mm-hmm. I think that's a little bit how the health IT is going to have to do with interoperability, that if enough people, it is going to take a while to kind of get everyone connected and And interoperability is something that needs to have kind of a mass buy-in to have its effectiveness. But at some point it will, and then it's just going to become expected that, yes, I can ask for so-and-so's health record and have it shared with me because I'm treating that patient right here and I can get to it. I do think it's going to get there. I'm not Pollyanna thinking that it's just going to happen magically. There's a lot of things to overcome. But I will say that actually of all the stuff from the Cures update, I know that the APIs have gotten justifiably a lot of, attention, and I am encouraged by that. I think the TEFCA, National Interoperability Network is by far the holy grail that we need to get. I mean, I think to me, that's what, there are certainly there are patients who want access to their data, and they deserve to have it. They paid for it. So I believe that totally. But what you really want as a patient, to be honest, is to not be a patient anymore. I don't want to be seen anymore. I want you to take care of my problem so I can go home. And honestly, that's what the providers, they're wanting to heal and care for people. And for them to do that, they need access to the data that's been, pushed around in our, all these practices and out there. So if we can find ways to connect it, that's going to be hard. I really do find that's when you're going to start seeing some of the payoff on what we've talked about for a long time. So, I mean, again, that's the scaffolding that we're building. We are making some progress there. It's not simple. It's not easy, but that's why I'm really encouraged by thinking like that's, you're going to see a lot of these things under the hood, or you won't see these things when they're under the hood next year.
Yes.
But I'm hoping the providers are going to start seeing those a lot more in 2023, 2024. Like, oh, wow. Yeah.
And using them. Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we have certainly seen a lot more avenues of care. Part of it has been because of the COVID emergency, the telehealth, televisits, but also growing is remote patient monitoring. And then we've got, so I kind of wonder, do you think we'll see some kind of standards of certification around those types of delivery of care, as well as we're going to start seeing certifications around specialties like pediatrics and oncology? You think we'll see some of that? Yeah.
I am really curious about that as well. I think I do think the key word is the certification, and maybe what do we mean by that? Because I think one of the things, one of the criticisms you hear about any of the health IT right now is usually around usability or burden it's put on. And then we also hear about interoperability. And I think part of those are, and again, not saying they're not by very much justified in many cases. I think part of the challenge is when you're building a national program, for all provider, all, health IT systems, that you kind of, those are our specialties tend to get left behind because, you're doing things that's not, conducive to their workflows. And I don't, there was probably no other way that we could have gotten where we're at without doing this. We had to kind of do this broad mass program. But I think then what we see is that to make these other pieces come together, we're going to have to design programs that are going to support them. And so I do really think that that's these more, I don't say niche, but specialized certifications or health IT kind of programs, I really think can provide value. I think a couple things have to happen though. We can't make them, it has to be an or, I think, not just an and. Like you can't just say you have to do the ONC certification and this, let's say pediatric certification, because there's some things that just don't align with them. I mean, there's a lot of overlap, but we can't. And so I know, I mentioned Drummond Group. I still good relationship with them, and I think a lot of them as my past employer and what they presently do. I know they've announced, this is not a secret, they're looking to develop a pediatric certification program, which I'm really encouraged by that idea and what it can open up. I'm hoping that it will then serve those areas of people who've been left behind, and again, they can expand it, or other people can fill that in there. I think then what we have to do, though, especially from the reimbursement community and CMS, is find ways that they can somehow recognize that so that there can be a justification for people, frankly, the ROI to spend the money on it and implement it and so on. But it should not be necessarily opposed to ONC certification, but they have to recognize there's some things that, if you're a pediatrician, you're probably not going to need to, whatever it is, think about documenting, say, a syndronic surveillance type of thing. I mean, that, again, I'm not saying it couldn't come up, but just things like this that we are say, all right, these don't quite fit for us, or maybe I even think about things like we going back with like the demographics requirements right now for the ONC, which they've expanded to include things like sexual identity and
yes,
gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and that totally makes sense in especially with adults and even you say teens, but if you're an adolescent, you're treating a 2-month-old.
Yes,
those are things. Why would I build that in there? Kind of
Yep.
thing. So those are the things I think that ONC and CMS have to recognize. What are necessary things for all systems versus things that are not? And if they do that, I think they can build those places up. So I to your question, I do think there's going to be a bigger push for these people who've now been kind of left behind. And I'm encouraged by that. I think that can really serve them well. I think the certification, though, has to be in a way oriented with the current programs that you're right. ONC it dominates health IT right now. Yep. And hopefully they can relax that. There was direction in the Cures Act for ONC to kind of establish a pediatric certification program. They really, to be honest, they kind of punted on that in the Cures rule. They talked about how they could align their existing certification program with that, but I don't think that was maybe the intent. Well, hopefully they'll come back and revisit that some. Because, I think we've got to recognize that our health IT systems are not all made the same, nor should they be.
Absolutely. And Kyle, that's probably, we're out of time. That's probably a perfect place to set it down. They're different and the needs of providers are different. But before I let you go, Kyle, how can people get in touch with you to find out more about your services?
Sure. I mean, I have a website. It's Chart Lux, ChartLux.com, chartlux.com. You can hit me there. Honestly, going to LinkedIn may be the best way. You can just look me up in LinkedIn and send me a message. I'll be glad to reply to that. Or you can hit me at my email, Kyle, Kyle, at chartlux.com or info@chartlux.com. But I usually just tell people go to LinkedIn, and most people are on that, and
Great.
Shoot me a message. I'll be glad to talk with you. I mean, I do lots of I'd be glad to have a couple calls just to kind of explain things and get you comfortable, and hopefully they can go somewhere. If not, that's the end of it. I still always want to be helpful. I do want to give people the guidance. That's what gives me the joy, frankly, in what I do is, explaining things and seeing people have the light come on for them. But it would be great to hear from anyone.
Well, great. Well, thanks for that. And to our audience, thanks for joining me on this episode of the Tate Chronicles. I offer a special salute to my guest today, Kyle Meadors of the Chart Lux Consulting. Kyle, thanks for coming aboard today.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
You can find more information on this show's program page at healthcarenowradio.com. Until we meet again, here's wishing you fair winds and safe harbors.
Tate Chronicles transmission ending now.